Ha Ca Minh, Southern Vietnamese pronunciation Hoi microampere copyright T°C EJ section Mini section A. May 19, 1890 Euro September 2, 1969, born Nguyen Sinh Côn, or Nguyen Sinh Cung, also known as Nguyen Thien Thi Nh and Nguyen Ai Quay Si, was a Vietnamese communist revolutionary leader who was Prime Minister and President of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. He was a key figure in the foundation of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in 1945, as well as the People's Army of Vietnam and the Viet Cong registered trademark NG during the Vietnam War. He led the Viet Minh independence movement from 1941 onward, establishing the communist-ruled Democratic Republic of Vietnam in 1945 and defeating the French Union in 1954 at the Battle of Bien Pha section. He officially stepped down from power in 1965 due to health problems, but remained a highly visible figurehead and inspiration for those Vietnamese fighting for his cause a united, communist Vietnam until his death. After the war, Saigon, the former capital of the Republic of Vietnam, was renamed Ha Ca Minh City. However, the name Saigon is still very widely used. Early life: Ho Chi Minh was born Nguyen Sinh Côn, or Nguyen Sinh Cung, in 1890 in the village of Ho Ng Tra to I, his Muth era unregistered trademark S village. From 1895, he grew up in his father Nguyen Sinh Za Ca unregistered trademark S village of Lo Ng Sen, Kim Lien, Nam An, Nan Province. He had 3 siblings, his sister Ba Ch Lien, a clerk in the French army. His brother Nguyen Sinh Kia M, a geomancer and traditional herbalist. And another brother who died in his infancy. As a young child, Nguyen studied with his father before more formal classes with a scholar named Vuong Thuc Du. Nguyen quickly mastered Chinese writing, a prerequisite for any serious study of Confucianism, while honing his colloquial Vietnamese writing. In addition to his studious endeavors, he was fond of adventure, and loved to fly kites and go fishing. Following Confucian tradition, at the age of 10, his father gave him a new name, Nguyen Thien Thi Nh. Nguyen's father, Nguyen Sinh Za Si, was a Confucian scholar and teacher, and later an imperial magistrate in the small remote district of Vinh Chi. He was demoted for abuse of power after an influential local figure died several days after having received 102 strokes of the cane as punishment for an infraction. In deference to his father, Nguyen received a French education, attended L'École Copyright in Hue, the alma mater of his later disciples, Pham Va Floren Naang and Ben-Gurion Giap, and his later enemy, Ngo Dinh Diem. First sojourn in France. It is believed that Nguyen was involved in an anti-tax demonstration of poor peasants in Hue in 1907, which endangered his student status at Collège Équacy. A document from the Centre des Archives d'Outre-mer in France however indicates that he was admitted to Collège Équacy on August 8, 1908, which was several months after the anti-Corva copyright demonstration. He chose to leave school in order to find a chance to go abroad. Because his father had been dismissed, he had no longer a hope for a governmental scholarship and went southward, taking a position at Dien Thanh School in Phan Thi for about 6 months, then traveled to Zaigar Square Den. He worked as a kitchen helper on a French steamer, the Amiral de la Touche copyright Ville, while using the alias Va Floren N. Bar. The steamer departed on June 5, 1911 and arrived in Marseille, France in December. There he applied for the French Colonial Administrative School but his application was rejected. Instead, he decided to begin traveling the world by working on ships and visited many countries from 1911 to 1917. In the United States, in 1911, while working as the cook's helper on a ship, Nguyen traveled to the United States. From 1912–13, he lived in New York and Boston, where he worked as a baker at the Parker House Hotel. Among a series of menial jobs, he claimed to have worked for a wealthy family in Brooklyn between 1917–18, and for General Motors as a line manager. It is believed that, while in the United States, he made contact with Korean nationalists, an experience that developed his political outlook. In the United Kingdom, at various points between 1913 and 1919, Nguyen lived in West Ealing, and later in Crouch End, Hornsey. He reportedly worked as either a chef or dishwasher. Reports vary at the Drayton Court Hotel in West Ealing. It is claimed that Nguyen trained as a pastry chef under Auguste Escoffier at the Carlton Hotel in the Haymarket, Westminster, but there is no evidence to support this. However, the wall of New Zealand House, home of the New Zealand High Commission, which now stands on the site of the Carlton Hotel, displays a blue plaque, stating that Nguyen worked there in 1913 as a waiter. Nguyen was also employed as a pastry boy on the New Haven Deep Ferry route in 1913. Political education in France. From 1919 to Euro 23, while living in France, Nguyen began to show an interest in politics, being influenced by his friend and Socialist Party of France comrade Marcel Katchen. Nguyen claimed to have arrived in Paris from London in 1917, but the French police only had documents recording his arrival in June 1919. He joined a group of Vietnamese nationalists in Paris whose leaders were Phan Chu Trinh and Phan Va Florin Entre Degree ONG, bearing a new name Nguyen Ai Quay Si. Following World War I, the group petitioned for recognition of the civil rights of the Vietnamese people in French Indochina to the Western powers at the Versailles peace talks, but was ignored. Citing the language and the spirit of the U.S. Declaration of Independence, they expected U.S. President Woodrow Wilson to help remove the French colonial rule from Vietnam and ensure the formation of a new, nationalist government. Although they were unable to obtain consideration at Versailles, the failure further radicalized Nguyen, while also making him a symbol of the anti-colonial movement at home in Vietnam. In 1920, Nguyen became a representative to the Congress of Tours of the Socialist Party of France. Quay Si voted for the Third International and a founding member of the Parti Communiste Français Section A's. Taking a position in the Colonial Committee of the PCF, he tried to draw his comrades' attention towards people in French colonies including Indochina, but his efforts were often unsuccessful. During this period he began to write journal articles and short stories as well as running his Vietnamese nationalist group. In May 1922, Nguyen wrote an article for a French magazine criticizing the use of English words by French sports writers. The article implored Prime Minister Raymond Poincaré copyright to outlaw such franglais as Le Manager, Le Round and Le Knockout. While living in Paris, he reportedly had a relationship with a dressmaker named Marie Briery. In the Soviet Union and China, in 1923, Nguyen left Paris for Moscow, where he was employed by the Comintern, studied at the Communist University of the Toilers of the East, and participated in the Fifth Comintern Congress in June 1924, before arriving in Canton, China, in November 1924. In 1925 Euro 26 he organized youth education classes, and occasionally gave socialist lectures to Vietnamese revolutionary young people living in Canton at the Whampoa Military Academy. These young people would become the seeds of a new revolutionary, pro-communist movement in Vietnam several years later. According to Duca, he lived with and married a Chinese woman, Ta Florin Ng Tua T Min, on October 18, 1926. When his comrades objected to the match, he told them, I will get married despite your disapproval because I need a woman to teach me the language and keep house. She was 21 and he was 36. They married in the same place where Zhou Enlai had married earlier, and then lived in the residence of a Comintern agent, Mikhail Borodin. Hong Va Florin Nkar argued that in June 1925, Nguyen betrayed Phan Ba and registered trademark I Ka sent you, the famous leader of a rival revolutionary faction and his father's old friend, to French Secret Service agents in Shanghai for 100,000 piastres. A source states that Nguyen later claimed he did it because he expected Ka Sent You's trial to stir up anti-French sentiment, and because he needed the money to establish a communist organization. In Ho Chi Minh, A Life, William Duca repudiated this hypothesis. Other sources claim that Nguyen the degree Ng was responsible for Shao's capture. Shao, sentenced to lifetime house arrest, never denounced Nguyen Ai Quay Si. Chiang Kai-shek's 1927 anti-communist coup triggered a new era of exile for Nguyen. He left Canton again in April 1927 and returned to Moscow, spending some of the summer of 1927 recuperating from tuberculosis in the Crimea, before returning to Paris once more in November. He then returned to Asia by way of Brussels, Berlin, Switzerland, and Italy, where he sailed to Bangkok, Thailand, arriving in July 1928. Although we have been separated for almost a year, our feelings for each other do not have to be said in order to be felt. He reassured Min in an intercepted letter. In this period, he served as a senior agent undertaking Comintern activities in Southeast Asia. He remained in Thailand, staying in the Thai village of Natchok, until late 1929 when he moved on to India, then Shanghai. In early 1930, in Hong Kong, Nguyen Ai Quay chaired a meeting with representatives from two Vietnamese communist parties in order to merge them into a unified organization, Communist Party of Vietnam. In June 1931, he was arrested in Hong Kong. To reduce French pressure for extradition, it was announced in 1932 that Nguyen Ai Quay had died. The British quietly released him in January 1933. He made his way back to Moscow, Russia, where he studied and taught at the Lenin Institute. He moved to the Soviet Union, where he spent several years recovering from tuberculosis. It is said that in this period he lost his positions in the Comintern because of a concern that he had betrayed the organization. His influence among his Vietnamese comrades faded significantly. In 1938, he was allowed to return to China and served as an advisor to the Chinese Communist Armed Forces, which later forced China's government into exile on Taiwan. Around 1940, Quay began regularly using the name Ha Ca Minh, a Vietnamese name combining a common Vietnamese surname with a given name meaning he who has been enlightened, and Minh meaning bright. Independence movement. In 1941, Ho returned to Vietnam to lead the Viet Minh independence movement. The Men in Black were a 10,000-member guerrilla force that operated with the Viet Minh. He oversaw many successful military actions against the Vichy French and Japanese occupation of Vietnam during World War II, supported closely but clandestinely by the United States Office of Strategic Services, and later against the French bid to reoccupy the country. He was jailed in China by Chiang Kai-shek's local authorities before being rescued by Chinese communists. Following his release in 1943, he returned to Vietnam. In April 1945 Ho met with the OSS agent Archimedes Patty and offered to provide intelligence to the Allies provided that he could have a line of communication with the Allies. The OSS agreed to this and later sent a military team of OSS members to train Ho's men, and Ho himself was treated for malaria and dysentery by an OSS doctor. Following the August Revolution organized by the Viet Minh, Ho became chairman of the provisional government and issued a proclamation of independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Although he convinced Emperor Ba Pound Oai to abdicate, his government was not recognized by any country. He repeatedly petitioned American President Harry S. Truman for support for Vietnamese independence, citing the Atlantic Charter, but Truman never responded. According to some sources, during a power struggle in 1945, the Viet Minh killed members of rival groups, such as the leader of the Constitutional Party, Bui Quang Chiu, the head of the Party for Independence, and Ngo Dinh Diem's brother, Ngo Dinh Coi. Purges and killings of Trotskyists were also documented in the Black Book of Communism. Ho, when asked by a reporter about the murder of Ta Bu Tho, a leading Trotskyist and personal friend, answered matter-of-factly, anyone who does not follow the line determined by me will be smashed. In 1946, future Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion and Ho Chi Minh stayed at the same hotel in Paris, and became very friendly. Ho Chi Minh offered Ben-Gurion a Jewish home in exile in Vietnam. Ben-Gurion turned the offer down, however, telling Ho Chi Minh, "I am certain we shall be able to establish a Jewish government in Palestine." In 1946, when Ho traveled outside of the country, his subordinates imprisoned 2,500 non-communist nationalists and forced 6,000 others to flee. hundreds of political opponents were jailed or exiled in July 1946, notably members of the National Party of Vietnam and the Dai Viet National Party, after a failed attempt to raise a coup against the Viet Minh government. All rival political parties were hereafter banned and local governments were purged to minimize opposition later on. However, it was noted that the Democratic Republic of Vietnam's first Congress had over two-thirds of its members come from non-Viet Minh political factions, some without election. NPV party leader Nguyen Ha Pound Ithor Section N was named vice president. They also held 4 out of 10 ministerial positions. Birth of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, on September 2, 1945, following Emperor Ba Pound Oai's abdication, Ho Chi Minh read the Declaration of Independence of Vietnam, under the name of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. In Saigon, with violence between rival Vietnamese factions and French forces increasing, the British commander, General Sir Douglas Gracey, declared martial law. On September 24, the Viet Minh leaders responded with a call for a general strike. In September 1945, a force of 200,000 Republic of China Army troops arrived in Hanoi. Ho made a compromise with their general, Liu Han, to dissolve the Communist Party and to hold an election which would yield a coalition government. When Chiang later traded Chinese influence in Vietnam for French concessions in Shanghai, Ho Chi Minh had no choice but to sign an agreement with France on March 6, 1946, in which Vietnam would be recognized as an autonomous state in the Indo-Chinese Federation and the French Union. The agreement soon broke down. The purpose of the agreement, for both the French and Viet Minh, was to drive out Chiang's army from North Vietnam. Fighting broke out in the north soon after the Chinese left. The last time the Chinese came, they stayed 1,000 years. The French are foreigners. They are weak. Colonialism is dying. The white man is finished in Asia. But if the Chinese stay now, they will never go. As for me, I prefer to sniff French shit for 5 years than to eat Chinese shit for the rest of my life. Ho Chi Minh, 1946. The Viet Minh then collaborated with French colonial forces to massacre supporters of the Vietnamese nationalist movements in 1945 June. The Communists eventually suppressed all non-communist parties but failed to secure a peace deal with France. In the final days of 1946, after a year of diplomatic failure and many concessions in agreements such as the Dalit and Fontainebleau conferences, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam government found that war was inevitable. The bombardment of Haiphong by French forces at Hanoi only strengthened the belief that France had no intention of allowing an autonomous, independent state in Vietnam. On December 19, 1946, Ho, representing his government, declared war against the French Union, marking the beginning of the Indochina War. The Vietnam National Army, by then mostly armed with machetes and muskets, immediately attacked, waging assault against French positions, smoking them out with straw bundled with chili pepper, destroying armored vehicles with lunge mines and Molotov cocktails, holding off attackers by using roadblocks, mines and gravel. After 2 months of fighting, the exhausted Viet Minh forces withdrew after systematically destroying any valuable infrastructure. Ho was reported to be captured by a group of French soldiers led by Gina Permilchan Vorlai at Via T Bar C in Operation Lee. The person in question turned out to be a Viet Minh advisor, who was later killed trying to escape. According to journalist Bernard Fall, after fighting the French for several years, Ho decided to negotiate a truce. The French negotiators arrived at the meeting site, a mud hut with a thatched roof. Inside they found a long table with chairs and were surprised to discover in one corner of the room a silver ice bucket containing ice and a bottle of good champagne, which should have indicated that Ho expected the negotiations to succeed. One demand by the French was the return to French custody of a number of Japanese military officers, in order for them to stand trial for war crimes committed during World War II. Ho replied that the Japanese officers were allies and friends whom he could not betray. Then he walked out, to 7 more years of war. In February 1950, after the successful removal of the French borders blockade, Ho met with Stalin and Mao Zedong in Moscow after the Soviet Union recognized his government. They all agreed that China would be responsible for backing the Viet Minh. Mao's emissary to Moscow stated in August that China planned to train 70,000 Viet Minh in the near future. The road to the outside world was open for Viet Minh forces to receive additional supplies which allow them to escalate the fight against the French regime throughout Indochina. In 1954, after the crashing defeat of French Union forces at Battle of Dien Bien Phu, France was forced to give up its fight against the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh assassinated up to 150,000 civilians during the war. Becoming president and Vietnam War. The 1954 Geneva Accords concluded between France and the Viet Minh, allowing the latter's forces to regroup in the north whilst anti-communist groups settled in the south. Ho's Democratic Republic of Vietnam relocated to Hanoi and became the government of North Vietnam, a communist-led single-party state. Following the Geneva Accords, there was to be a 300-day period in which people could freely move between the two regions of Vietnam, later known as South Vietnam and North Vietnam. More than 1 million North Vietnamese people fled to the south, while a much smaller number moved north. It is estimated that as many as 2 million more would have left had they not been stopped by the Viet Minh. Neither the United States government nor Ngo Dinh Diem's state of Vietnam signed anything at the 1954 Geneva Conference. With respect to the question of reunification, the non-communist Vietnamese delegation objected strenuously to any division of Vietnam, but lost out when the French accepted the proposal of Viet Minh delegate Van Van Dong, who proposed that Vietnam eventually be united by elections under the supervision of local commissions. The United States countered with what became known as the American Plan, with the support of South Vietnam and the United Kingdom. It provided for unification elections under the supervision of the United Nations, but was rejected by the Soviet delegation in North Vietnamese. In North Vietnam during the 1950s, political opposition groups were suppressed. Those publicly opposing the government were imprisoned in hard labor camps. Many middle-class, intellectual Northerners had been lured into speaking out against Ho's communist regime, and most of those who did were later imprisoned in gulags or executed. This became known as the Nha Centen Va Florin Na Euro Jai Fair Copyright M affair. Some prisoners died of exhaustion, starvation, illness, or assault by prison guards. Political scientist J. Rummel suggests a figure of 24,000 camp deaths during Ho's rule of North Vietnam between 1945 and 1956. The government launched rent reduction and land reform programs, which, according to Stephen Rosefielder, were aimed at exterminating class enemies. Declassified Politburo documents confirm that 1 in 1,000 North Vietnamese were the minimum quota targeted for execution during the earlier rent reduction campaign. The number killed during the multiple stages of the considerably more radical land reform was probably many times greater. Lam Than Haliem, a major authority on land issues in Vietnam, conducted multiple interviews in which communist cadres gave estimates for land reform executions ranging from 120,000 to 200,000. Such figures match the nearly 150,000 houses and huts which were allocated to new occupants. A number of sources have suggested that about 30% of the landlords executed were actually Communist Party members. Landlords were arbitrarily classified as 5.68% of the population, but the majority were subject to less severe punishment than execution. Official records from the time suggest that 172,008 landlords were executed during the land reform, of whom 123,266 were later found to be wrongly classified. Victims were reportedly shot, beheaded, and beaten to death. Some were tied up, thrown into open graves and covered with stones until they were crushed to death. The full death toll was even greater because victims' families starved to death under the policy of isolation. As communist defector Lik Xuan Chiu explained, there was nothing worse than the starvation of the children in a family whose parents were under the control of a land reform team. They isolated the house, and the people who lived there would starve. The children were all innocent. There was nothing worse than that. They wanted to see the whole family dead. Ho Ng Va Florin Nka wrote that as many as 500,000 North Vietnamese may have died during the 1950s and 1960s as a result of the policies of Ho's government. In 1956, about 6,000 peasants in An province were allegedly massacred by PAVN government troops in response to a revolt against unbearable taxes. At the end of 1959, La Dua Copyright N was appointed by Ho to be the acting party leader, after becoming aware that the nationwide election would never happen and Diem's intention to purge out all opposing forces. Ho began requesting the Politburo to send aid to the Viet Cong's uprising in South Vietnam. This was considered by Western's analyzers as a loss of power by Ho, who is said to have preferred the more moderate Giap for the position. North Vietnam invaded Laos in 1959 aided by the Pathet Lao, and used 30,000 men to build invasion and supply routes through Laos known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which allowed the North to send troops and aid to the Viet Cong through Laos and Cambodia, thus escalating the war and tipping the balance, turning it to their favor. Duan was officially named party leader in 1960, leaving Ho a public figure rather than actually governing the country. Ho maintained much influence in the government. Ta Ha Yu, La Dua Copyright N, Trae Degree Ong Chine, and Pho Va Florin Naang would often share dinner with him, and later all of them remained key figures of Vietnam throughout and after the war. In 1963, Ho purportedly corresponded with South Vietnamese President Diem in the hopes of achieving a negotiated peace. This correspondence was a factor in the U.S. decision to tacitly support a coup against Diem in November later that year. In late 1964, PAVN combat troops were sent southwest into officially neutral Laos and Cambodia. According to Chen Zhan, during the mid to late 1960s, Le Duan permitted 320,000 Chinese volunteers into North Vietnam to help build infrastructure for the country, thereby freeing a similar number of PAVN personnel to go south. However, there are no sources from Vietnam, US or the USSR confirming the number of Chinese troops stationed in northern Vietnam. By early 1965, US combat troops began arriving in South Vietnam, first to protect the air bases around Chu Ly and Da Nang, later to take on most of the fight, as more and more American troops were put in to replace Saigon troops who could not, or would not, get involved in the fighting. As fighting escalated, widespread aerial and artillery bombardment all over North Vietnam by the U.S. Air Force and Navy began with Operation Rolling Thunder. In July 1967, Ho and most of the Politburo of Workers' Party of Vietnam met in a high-profile conference where they all concluded the war had fallen into a stalemate, since the United States Army presence forced the People's Army of Vietnam to expend the majority of their resources maintaining the Ho Chi Minh Trail instead of reinforcing their comrades' ranks in the south. With Ho's permission, the Viet Cong planned to execute the Tet Offensive to begin on January 31, 1968, gambling on taking the south by force and defeating the U.S. military. The offensive came at great cost and with heavy casualties on NLF's political branches and armed forces. It appeared to Ho and to the rest of his government that the scope of the action had shocked the world, which had up until then been assured that the Communists were on the ropes. The overly positive spin that the U.S. military had been attempting to achieve for years came crashing down. The bombing of northern Vietnam and Ho Chi Minh Trail was halted, and U.S. and Vietnamese negotiators began to discuss how to end the war. From then on, Ho and his government's strategy, based on the idea of avoiding conventional warfare and facing the might of the U.S. Army, which would wear them down eventually, while merely prolonging the conflict would lead to eventual acceptance of Hanoi's terms materialized. Ho remained in Hanoi during his final years, demanding the unconditional withdrawal of all non-Vietnamese troops in South Vietnam. By 1969, with negotiations still dragging on, Ho's health began to deteriorate from multiple health problems, including diabetes which prevented him from participating in further active politics. However, he insisted that his forces in the south continue fighting until all of Vietnam was reunited under his regime regardless of the length of time that it might take, believing the time was on his side. Death. With the outcome of the Vietnam War still in question, Ho Chi Minh died at 9:47 a.m. on the morning of September 2, 1969 from heart failure at his home in Hanoi, aged 79. His embalmed body is currently on display in a mausoleum in Ba Dinh Square in Hanoi despite his will requesting that he be cremated. News of his death was withheld from the North Vietnamese public for nearly 48 hours because he had died on the anniversary of the founding of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. He was not initially replaced as president, but a collective leadership composed of several ministers and military leaders took over, known as the Politburo. During North Vietnam's final campaign, a famous song written by Hue Thuc was often sung by People's Army of Vietnam soldiers, Ba Si Vo Nha to the first Ng Ka U Hoan H Quay Cent N. 6 years after his death, at the fall of Saigon, several PAVN tanks in Saigon displayed a poster with the words Ba Si Vo Nha to the first Ng Ka U Hoan H Quay Cent N. Legacy and personality cult. The former capital of South Vietnam, Saigon, was officially renamed Ho Chi Minh City on July 2, 1976 by the new VCP-controlled National Assembly of Vietnam. However, the name provoked strong anti-communist feeling in a substantial number of Vietnamese. Many Vietnamese, especially those living abroad, continue to refer to the city as Dai Ga Square Den, in rejection of the new communist-imposed name and in honor of the former capital of anti-communist, Republican South Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh City is honored by Ho Chi Minh's achievements and accomplishments. Ho's embalmed body is on display in Hanoi in a granite mausoleum modeled after Lenin's tomb in Moscow. Streams of people queue each day, sometimes for hours, to pass his body in silence. This is reminiscent of other communist leaders like Kim Jong-il and his father Kim Il-sung, Vladimir Lenin, and Mao Zedong. The Ho Chi Minh Museum in Hanoi is dedicated to his life and work. Chilean musician Victor Jara referenced Ho Chi Minh in his song El Derecho de Vivir en Paz. In Vietnam today, Ho's image appears on the front of all Vietnamese currency notes. His portrait and bust are featured prominently in most of Vietnam's public buildings, in classrooms and in some families' altars. There is at least one temple dedicated to him, built in Vinh Long shortly after his death, in 1970, in Viet Cong-controlled areas. The communist regime has also continually maintained a personality cult around Ho Chi Minh since the 1950s in the north, and later extended it to the south, which it sees as a crucial part in their propaganda campaign about Ho and the party's past. Ho Chi Minh is frequently glorified in schools to school children. Opinions, publications and broadcasts that are critical of Ho Chi Minh or that identify his flaws are banned in Vietnam. Vietnamese and foreign activists, writers, reporters and commentators who criticize anything about Ho in the slightest are arrested and imprisoned or fined for opposing the People's Revolution. Ho Chi Minh is even glorified to a religious status as an immortal saint by the Vietnamese Communist Party, and some people worship the president, according to a BBC report. Publications about Ho's non-celibacy are banned in Vietnam, because the party maintains that Ho had no romantic relationship with anyone in his lifetime in order to portray a puritanical image of Ho to the Vietnamese public, and advance the image of Ho as the father of the Communist Revolution, and of a celibate married only to the cause of revolution. A newspaper editor in Vietnam was dismissed from her post in 1991 for publishing a story about Tang Tuat Minh. William Duke as Ho Chi Minh, a life presents much information on Ho's relationships. The government requested substantial cuts in the official Vietnamese translation of Duke's book, which was refused. In 2002, the Vietnamese government suppressed a review of Duke's book in the Far Eastern Economic Review. In 1987, UNESCO officially recommended to member states that they join in the commemoration of the centenary of the birth of President Ho Chi Minh by organizing various events as a tribute to his memory, considering the important and many-sided contribution of President Ho Chi Minh in the fields of culture, education and the arts, who devoted his whole life to the national liberation of the Vietnamese people, contributing to the common struggle of peoples for peace, national independence, democracy and social progress. However, this was met with an uproar amongst some overseas Vietnamese, especially in North America, Europe and Australia, who criticize Ho as a Stalinist dictator and blamed Ho for the human rights abuses of his government. There's also a personality cult surrounding Nguyen Shines R.C., Ho Chi Minh's father. References. Further reading, essays, Bernard B. Fall, ed. 1967. Ho Chi Minh on Revolution and War, Selected Writings 1920 Euro 1966. New American Library. Biography, William J. Duca. 2000. Ho Chi Minh, A Life. Thua. Jean Le Couture. 1968. Ho Chi Minh, A Political Biography. Random House. Kasi Huen. 1971. Vision Accomplished. The Enigma of Ho Chi Minh. The Macmillan Company. David Halberstam 1971. Ho. Roman and Littlefield. Ha Ka Minh To En Ta P. NXB Ka En H Tra Que Si Gia, Sophie Quinn Judge. 2003. Ho Chi Minh, The Missing Years. C. Hurst and Company. ISBN 1-85065-658-4. That Thian, was Ho Chi Minh a nationalist? Ho Chi Minh and the Kuomintang Information and Resource Center, Singapore, 1990. The Viaduct T. Minh, NLF and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, William J. Duca. 1981. The Communist Road to Power in Vietnam. Westview Press. Oang Van Chi 1964. From Colonialism to Communism. Praja. Truong Nhu Tang 1986. A Viet Cong Memoir. Vintage. The War in Vietnam, Francis Fitzgerald 1972. Fire in the Lake, The Vietnamese and the Americans in Vietnam. Little, Brown and Company. American Foreign Policy, Henry A. Kissinger. 1979. White House Years. Little, Brown. Richard Nixon. 1987. No More Vietnams. Arbor House Pub Company. External links. The Drayton Court Hotel, Ha Ka Minh Obituary, The New York Times, September 4, 1969, Time 100, Ha Ka Minh, Ho Chi Minh Selected Writings, Ha Ka Minh's Biography, Satellite photo of the mausoleum on Google Maps, Final tribute to Ha from the Central Committee of the Vietnam Workers' Party, Bibliography, Writings by and about Ha Ka Minh, Booknotes Interview with William Duca on Ha Ka Minh, A Life, November 12, 2000.